Yo, 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 what's up, all you burners, stoners, and potheads, and especially all you gardeners out there? This is Mr. Weedman and Big Earl with the Grow Hour. Big Earl, my brother, how the hell are you?
What's up? I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. You want to know why?
Why?
Because we have our friend Terpfi3nd back. What's up, Terp? How you doing, brother?
What's good, guys? Stoked about this.
Oh, man, so glad to have you back, because we're going to be talking about today, to flush or not to flush. Is that the question, or is that the answer? By Mr. Terpfi3nd here. So, but before we get started on this, we're going to smoke some weed. Terp, in your honor, what are you smoking, my friend?
The ego death. This strain has literally brought me to my knees a few times this week. It's my go-to when nothing else will work. And it's gotten to the point where like 2 or 3 times this week I had to be like, yeah, I'm going to have to chill. Like this is getting me in a little deeper than I expected. But yeah.
Now, let me ask you a question. Is it totally like what your favorite terp is? Myrcene, heavy myrcene, or is it a downer?
Yeah,
is
it's
it like
so,
knock you couch lock?
It's a blackout truffle Mecha Godzilla. It is heavy myrcene, just dank kush, heavy dank kush on the profile.
I'm coming over.
Yeah, it's one of those that like the blackout truffle, it's got all of the blackout truffle profile, but it's got this dense, dank, intense nug structure that really just rounds it off. Like the blackout might be my favorite to smoke, but the ego death is probably my favorite to grow and smoke.
Do you push that to hash at all?
Oh
Or
yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, it dumps.
How is it dumping for hash when you make it with hash? What's the experience?
It's awesome, but I will say it's when I say this, I've had people think that I'm just bullshitting or fluffing, and it's not really my style. I've had people grow it and come back and tell me that their customers are afraid of it. And when I tell people that, everybody's like, oh yeah, sure, bud. All right, whatever. And they all come back to me with the same line of, bro, I thought you were just talking shit. I got in a little too deep and I didn't know they made weed like that anymore. And it's the smoker smoke. Like it's when you've smoked 30 strains and you still need one to hit you in the head.
That's the one.
Yeah.
That's my kind. I love strains like that because I love that for nighttime sleepy sleep. Get me to bed, knockout punch. There's not many I get like that anymore. Like Earl just did some bubble gum, the Indiana version bubble gum that knocked me on my ass for sleepy sleep. It was perfect, and those are the strains I look for 10 o'clock to sleep. So that's and you've been talking about blackout truffle for a while since we've had on the show a couple of times. So one day I have to drive out to you one day and bring some home for nighttime.
I'll just get you guys some seeds. You can run it yourself. It's
hell yeah.
awesome.
I got some germinating right now.
Yeah, anytime.
Oh, then I got Earl right there hooking it up.
That was the pack I picked from you, Terp. I'm doing a run of like everybody we've had on.
Like I always tell anybody that knows me, if we deal with each other outside of just casual talk on the internet, if there's anything you guys ever want to run, just let me know. Just point, literally. I'll take it. Yeah,
your catalogs are so freaking cheap. If you go in and you buy every pack, it's so like that's what I did for a ton of lines from you because you do it for so cheap when like people really support. It's awesome.
Value. Terpfi3nd gives you a value to your weed. Never forget that.
Yeah. Multiple keepers in every pack, guaranteed.
There it is. What are you smoking on, Earl?
I got the 23, the Drunk Rider 23, and then a little bit of peanut butter breath for the end of the show. It gets me a little eye drop stony. So
there it is. Yeah. And I'm smoking the last nug of peach stank. Yeah. My last nuggy nug. I saved the best for last, so I appreciate this one, Earl. This is grown by you, smoked by me. I love it. So thank you so much for that peach stank. So, what's up?
Who bred that one?
Me. Peach stank. Nice. Yeah, Peachy Keen, which is my pick of it was a super heavy papaya leaner, but really soft flowers. Not a super good yielder, but I put it to a stanky haze. There's like big ass flowers, dense for a haze, but not dense, for what we're used to. But just some like a really nice weight, it hits most of the boxes. I would have liked for the papaya to come out. I don't know if you ever smoked the Peachy Keen. The papaya came out heavier in the Peachy Keen
than it
did in that peach stank. But
I have. It's delicious.
Peach stank, yeah.
Awesome.
It's like a funk haze papaya.
Did Wolfman do the Peachy Keen or did he do the peach stank for the last batch of hash?
Peach Stank. Peach
And
Keen's
that's
not
that.
around anymore. I got
Okay.
rid of that mom after I bred it. Because
that last batch of hash he made with that peach stank that I'm just smoking the last nug of.
Yeah,
kudos to Wolfman. Yeah. So and Terp, the hash that you showed on your Instagram, I don't know if it was last week or a few days ago. You showed a jar and it had some fucking just dude, what was that? That was fucking sick looking.
Man, I've been working on my sift. I've been doing a lot of static tech sift lately, and then I'm about to get back into processing rosin regularly. Man, I got to be honest, like it's another one of those things that like I love hash. Hash is a passion, but once you hit a certain scale with making hash, man, fuck is it a work? It's a lot of work. It's a ton of fucking, especially if you're into water hash. Man, it's a job. It's a full-time job. And so really I've always it's kind of the old school in me. Like you and I probably aren't too far off age-wise. When I first got into smoking hash, not too bad. We're a little bit off, but not you remember what I'm talking about. When I first came up, it was all you could get was old school pressed dark hash.
That's what I get from Jamaica.
Right. And once we started getting into like rosin and BHO and like all of this, man, I definitely feel like it's a form of hash that doesn't really get its fair due as much. It's starting to see a resurgence and people are really getting back into it. But I'm still a sucker for just old school pressed Temple Ball style hash. And yeah, that's
old school hash. I think I've noticed that too. A lot more people are appreciating that and liking like back in the day you rolled into flour and stuff, but it's like a bubble hash almost. If you put a lighter up to it and it bubbles, that's like, at least that's what I think of, like that old black hash. You can roll it in a snake. You can sprinkle it on a joint. You can make a patty and put it on top of a joint and just light one end of the patty and smoke it all the way across.
Yep.
You can do everything.
I love when Wolfman makes his temple balls for us. And when he makes his temple balls, and what you were talking about a minute, I mean, I know we talked about this last time we had you on about Wolfman's temple balls. They're just phenomenal. So, but I know we got to move forward real quick. So you're back, and this topic to flush or not to flush was really cool because I watched what you wrote, and you were there was some good stuff going on there. So what is a flush though?
Okay, so this is a rather tough question with a rather lengthy answer. Okay, the shortest of it is we want to force the plant as it enters the last stages of its life to use up everything that it's stored. So cannabis is a hyperaccumulator, which means that if you plant it in a field full of nutrients, it's going to suck them up and store them within its tissue. It's part of the beautiful thing about cannabis and hemp. But the problem with that is that's still stored in the plant towards the end of its life cycle. So as growers, our goal is generally, as we're entering that last stage, to make the plant use up everything that it's stored in its reserves. And in order to do that, what we generally do is deplete the medium, which means that we make the root zone almost as devoid of nutrition as we can. So that forces the plant to essentially start to cannibalize itself in a sense. It's using all that stored reserves, and essentially, in doing so, in the process of, just turning, what's the word I'm like, photosynthesis. Through the process of generally photosynthesis, it's using all of the rest of those nutrients. So, I didn't think, I'm going to be honest with you, man, I've been growing weed for decades now. I never thought that we would be having a discussion about whether flushing is important. And I think, if I'm being just real honest, I think what's happened is that when people hear flushing, they immediately think that we're supposed to spend weeks just drowning our plants. That's not really the goal. Depending on your feed and your medium, and essentially how much nutrition you still have stored in your root zone, the process is to kind of remove it over the last 2 weeks so that your plant has maybe a week of using pure reserves and getting towards that finished state. The reason we do it, the reason it's important, and I think Earl and I have literally said this to each other more than once, that any grower that's had to pull a crop earlier than expected has seen the difference in not getting a true flush. Now, the process of getting there can be very different depending on your medium and your nutrition, what level you're feeding at. It's going to be a lot different for somebody who's running 1,500 ppms in cocoa than it is for somebody who's running in organic soil, but they both need to flush. It's a process that happens because of the nature of cannabis and the nature of the way that it stores nutrients. If you want your weed to burn well and to burn to that perfect white ash and therefore to be nothing left when you're done smoking it, generally getting a good flush in is clutch.
Yeah. A lot of it, I think you can just look at nature. Look at nature outside. At the end of, the cycle of the season, things are dying off. There's less food available in the soil because so much has grown and so much has used a lot of that food. And so, I think that's what a lot of people, and it's on here to talk about a little later, a lot of people point to that and say, well, nature doesn't need a flush. And it's every single way that you feed at the end of the life cycle, the food is getting gone. The food is leaving the area in nature and in our it should be in our pots. That's just a part of nature we don't maybe pay attention to sometimes. Or I think, like you said, people hear flush and they generally think flood it for so long, and it's sometimes it's you've literally been flushing since week 6. And it's if you want to get into but
yeah,
how do you? I'm in a cocoa perlite. I like to flush for the 2 weeks, like you said, but my first week of those 2 weeks, I do a half nutrient. And I run maybe 20% extra on my feed. My reservoirs go for about 5 days, maybe 4 days instead of 7.
So let's be super specific. Let's say you're running a relatively heavy feed and you're looking at your week 8, right? Let's say you go week 8 and it's there, and I want to do 2 more weeks, right? Let's just say that's our situation. Let's say you're running into 12 to 1,500 ppm, okay? What I'm going to do on my first week is step down. So I'm going to switch to plain water. I'm going to monitor my ppms on my out, and I'm going to step it down. So you're not flooding the pot. Your first week, you want to use the amount that you would normally use plus a little runoff. You want to clean a little bit of runoff up, right? But you don't want to flood it. Your first week, you want to do wet cycle, dry cycle, wet cycle, dry cycle. You want to let it dry out. In between, it's going to naturally use up what's left in your root zone. Week 2 is going to be you forcing the plant to use up what it's stored. And none of it has to be fast. Like I said, you're kind of doing it over 2 weeks. You got plenty of time. In a week, you're probably going to have 3 to 4 wet, dry cycles. So you've got plenty of time. But by the end of your first week, you should be getting close to lower ppms in your runoff. And then by the end of week 2, that second week, you're going to step it up with a little more runoff. And by the end of that week, you'll be testing tap water. You'll be testing to the same ppms as your tap water. Now, if we're in soil, because it's just as important, and through the course of this conversation, I'm going to both steelman and debunk most of the arguments that have come up in this discussion, because there's a few, and I think most of them are largely nonsensical. The first one is generally that organic plants don't need to be flushed because nobody can exactly explain the rest of this problem. Nobody else can tell me why an organic plant stores nutrients just like a plant grown with salt, for instance, but you can't really tell me why it doesn't need to be flushed. The plant stores those nutrients just like it does anything else. Now, the benefit of soil is if you ran your soil properly through your flowering cycle, you should be close to not a ton of nutrients left in your soil at the end. But if you're top dressing, if you're one of those people that's top dressing all the way through flower, you're still adding more nutrients. This is kind of where having a good eye on your plants and just being able to look at your plants and kind of tell that they're getting huge nugs, dense flowers, your trichomes are ripe, you're getting to the end of flower. but you still want to flush in soil. So I recommend the same thing. And the only caveat, and Earl said he does a half feed. What I will do is occasionally I'll do molasses and water for the first week. But since that's still nutritious, you definitely want to cut that by the end of the second week. What that'll do is it'll increase resin production. It'll generally do the same thing a flush will. It forces the plants, if you're using like bacterial inoculants or anything living in your soil, it'll help to turbocharge all of that, force it to use up what's left. The second week is always going to be plain water, almost to a double runoff of what you're used to. By the end of 2 weeks, if you're in soil or if you're in cocoa or a soilless mix, there shouldn't be anything left. By the end of week 1, your root zone should be nearly non-nutritious. You should be in a situation where you're forcing your plants to use up everything stored. So the next argument is almost always, well, they don't flush tobacco. You don't really hear a lot of tobacco people talking about the finest nuances of their tobacco flavors. It's just generally tobacco's tobacco, and it is what it is, and it's grown in fields where stuff shits on it, and there's not a whole lot of regulation to how it's grown. That's a big argument that I hear a lot. People are saying, well, they don't flush tobacco. Cannabis is the most unique crop grown on the planet, in the sense that there is so many different variables, and then the way it's consumed is unlike anything else. Like, we smoke tobacco, but you don't care about the flavor. Well, then everybody goes, well, we don't flush tomatoes. Well, I don't smoke my vegetables. You know, it's a traditional, unique crop that over years of growing it, we've now figured out generally what works best. And that's what kind of blows me away, that we're having this, that it's really becoming almost a subculture of like, don't flush people. That's what started the discussion on my Instagram. That's what's continuing this discussion now. I've found Reddit to be a black hole for this.
Don't go. Culture. I love Reddit, but you do go in a black hole on that fucking that shit.
I think that may be where it started, and that's anything that starts on Reddit. My first instinct is, was this started to troll people? Like, was this started just to troll people? Because it's one of those things that, like, when we get into the discussion, there's a lot of argument, not a lot of logic, usually not lifers in the weed game that have this opinion. They're generally people that go, well, I don't flush my weed and it's great. Well, that's probably not the case. That's probably great to you, but if we put it in a room full of great weed, is it really that great if you didn't flush it? Like, the other thing is, you know, I think we've all had that benefit of sitting down with a whole bunch of different strains and just being able to maybe puff a bunch of different strains at once, whether you're doing a judging or a cup or just a sesh at a friend's house. I can almost always point to the one that didn't get the good flush.
Is it because it's harsh? A harsher smoke?
It's a little bit of that. It almost always affects how it burns. Now,
like, you get a deep burn in the throat.
Yeah,
that harsh kind of. Yeah,
that can usually be from not getting a good flush. Yeah,
that can be a fast dry too. Yep. If you dry really fast, that can get a real fucking harsh as well.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the other thing is just not getting a full term. So if you pull weed before it's really ripe and ready, you'll get that a lot, where it's not really developed. You probably didn't get a full grow and a full flush on it. Got a little bit of hay terps to it. You know, we've all pulled a little early and then thought, man, I wish I hadn't done that. Like, I wish I'd, and it's like, we've all done it. Anybody that's grown weed has probably pulled around way before you should have, and then kicked yourself in the ass when you realize it dried up to nothing and there's nothing here and it was just scraps, you know?
Yeah. Probably like the first 3 times you ever grew a plant.
Actually, you know what? The first 3 times I did it right. I think it was like grow like 7. I did it, or 8. And I'm like, I pulled it like a week way too early, and it still was good, you know, but it wasn't what it could have been. Yeah. That's the difference, because this plant was looking beautiful, and I fucked up somewhere along the way, and I told Mrs. Weedman, I said, check these trichomes out for me, please. She goes, oh, they look. She got a better eye for it than I do to see the color that I want, and she goes, no, I think you should pull it. I'm like, you sure? She's like, yeah. I said, all right, I think I should too. And that was my thought, and nope. I knew I could have done another. Maybe I could have done another 10 more days.
So I'm pretty big on a multi-prong attack to harvest time. And in all of this, we're kind of rolling the same topic because it's all kind of finishing and the process to get you to the end stage. But generally speaking, I forgot what I was about to say. I went too far. I'm sorry. What were we just talking about, man?
Didn't sound.
Yeah.
You were talking. Well, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Trichomes and harvest. Trichomes and harvest. So the kicker is when you're approaching harvest, you should be using bud density and formation, trichome color, and pistils. So if you're hitting week 8, 9, 10, and your plant is still just throwing massive amounts of white pistils everywhere, you're not ready. You're not there. If your plant is showing still mostly clear to white, you're not there. There seems to be this prevalent myth in cannabis that any amount of red trichomes or amber trichomes is a huge bad thing and you need to freak out and pull your plants immediately. Man, that's absolutely not true. Now, if you're looking at your plant and everything is dark red, you might have gone a little bit too far. But most of the time when I see people using trichomes alone, they almost always pull too early. So it has to kind of be bud development. It's got to be trichomes and then pistil death. So, we've all seen it. You get towards that last couple weeks, and when you really let it go as far as it needs to, most of those pistils will die unless you're running heavy sativas. Almost every one of them will get to a point where it's dying. And then you see in the last 2 weeks, the buds go from almost just scraps to these dense pieces of flower. And it's in that last couple weeks that you really pick up the most of your, density, your resin, your flavor. And that's really why pulling any point early, you really do a disservice to yourself and you waste your time.
Yeah. What do you what about a pre-flush? Do you do anything before the flush? Do you start moving some numbers around anywhere?
Yeah, so it really depends. If I'm running heavy cushes, if I'm running predominantly heavy indicas and cushes, they're almost always going to take more feed. So with stuff like that, and not to mention strains like that are almost always going to hold more nutrients as well. So you're going to need more of a flush. You're going to need more time for it to break down all that chlorophyll. You're going to really need it to use up everything that it's got. Whereas sativas generally are a little bit lighter feeders. They don't store quite as much. You generally don't have to flush sativas as hard to get them to that point where they're starting to show yellow and purple and start to change color and start to show fall time. But it really depends on what I'm running. So if I'm running cushes, I almost always run pretty heavily into week 6, 7. Almost all of my cushes will finish by week 9 at the latest. And by that point, they're done. They're almost dying on the vine. The other big kicker when you're kind of eyeing that last stage, you don't want your leaves to die on the plant. So there's a fine line between them yellowing and then them shriveling up and turning to crispy dust. By the time you got to crispy dust, you've probably gone a little bit too far because that's just going to be a bitch to trim and to process. And if you're making hash, it just beats green shit into your, it's not great. But otherwise, I will kind of taper sometimes around week 7, 8, depending on how quickly I'm trying to get it done. A lot of times I err on the side of a little bit of extra time is not going to hurt anything. Especially with the cushes, they don't tend to herm as much. They don't tend to have as many of those late stage problems that I see with more sativa dominant stuff. That stuff you almost always want to watch when you're hitting week 9, 10, 11, because they'll keep flowering and keep flowering and keep flowering. And to be honest with you, man, if you just keep letting them go, they'll eventually start herming too, because they just don't want to wrap up, but they also want to get pollinated really badly. So you'll start to see them start throwing a little bit of dust, and you'll start to see some seeds. So it's the more sativa stuff I have to watch a little more carefully.
Yeah. So like week 7 on a 10-weeker, so like 4 weeks early, maybe you start dropping the nitrogen maybe a little bit. And...
Yeah. To be honest, I just start cutting the nutrients in general. So like if I'm running hard into like 1,000 to 1,500 ppms going into full mid flower, once I start to see that development taper, you might as well start tapering the newts because they're eating less. Yeah. Like you can just generally see it when it hits a point where, like, especially with heavier, denser stuff, you can kind of just tell it's ready. Like she's ready to look at the door and give you the look to go. And you just kind of have to, it's a lot of it is perception, just being really aware of your grow, and kind of knowing your strains. And that's why I always tell people, man, as much as we all want to run all of the strains that are out there, sometimes the best thing you can do is pick a couple that you really love and run them a few good times. So you get a really good idea of what they bring to the table, how they perform, how they eat, how they start to look when they get to the end of the line. And all of that's super important, man. Knowing your strains is probably the most important part of growing, because there's little tricks and little things that you can do, but you kind of need to know how your strains are going to perform. Not all strains eat the same as far as like how much they can uptake. Not all strains can perform at the same level. Like I said, when you get into less hybridized stuff, just getting it to produce sometimes can be tough. So when you're starting to look at week 12, and it's still not really giving you the look towards the door, I don't really love to run strains like that, but just simply because everybody in growing time matters. Doesn't matter if you're running in a tent or if you're running in a massive commercial grow. Time matters. Whether it matters to the utmost and you can take plants for 2 and 3 cycles to make one round of weed, that not everybody can do that. So when I start to look at an extra month, that's extra time I could be flowering another round. 2 months? That's great. An extra 2 months is absolutely a wasted cycle. Yeah. So a lot of people look at things like that. And while there may be some cool, sativa that you really, really, really want to run and you're willing to put in that time, most people aren't. Most people look at anything past 8 weeks as, this is really taking up a lot of my space or a lot of my time. And doubly so if it's a commercial grow. Commercial grows are 60 days and out. It doesn't matter if it's ready. They're pulling it early, white hairs or not. They don't care. It's all coming down. So they generally will only run 60-day flat strains. It comes down to preference, a lot of it too. Like I said, Kushes tend to eat really heavy. So getting into that like final stage is kind of tricky and nuanced. You do want to kind of taper so that you're not hitting week 8 and you're still at some really high feed point. Because then you've still got 2 weeks to go, and they will freak out sometimes. I mean, it's not as common with sativas, but it's always a persistent issue with anything you're growing. We've all seen it happen. You get to that end, you're ready to cash out, you're ready to call the day, and then something happens, and now you got seeds in all your weed in the last 2 weeks. Planning is everything. Getting to that end stage so that you're kind of prepared for it is really important. And not just waiting to week 8 and then go, wait, I need to flush, Yeah.
So why does so many people claim they don't need to flush?
I just think it's lazy. Like I think there's twofold problems. I think one of it is lazy. I think it's just people will always want the shortest, quickest route to weed. They don't really want, they don't want to have to do the work. They don't want to have to do the nuance part. I think there is a persistent misunderstanding that organic weed doesn't need to be flushed, because the loudest group of people that I came to find were often people that were growing living organic, living soil. And I think I know where some of it comes from. There was one person in particular in that discussion, and I think she got really upset with me for saying it, for being, but she ran living beds, like soil beds, in her house or indoors. You can't flush that. There's a million reasons why you can't flush that. first of all, they're not really built to be flush 9 times out of 10. Second of all, when you're trying to turn around and replant your next round in the same beds, you still need them to be nutritious. So you still either have to go through a cycle of replenishing the soil or getting it back to a functional state. And so the notion is generally that, it's not important. Well, it's still important. It's just that the style that you're growing doesn't really allow you to do it. And I think with some of the organic growers specifically, I think that could have been the issue, is that with so many of them, they turn around and replant into the same beds or the same soil, which is a great process, but you can't flush at that point. I think the other thing is a general misconception about how organic plants feed. I think there's generally a misconception that organic plants don't eat the same type of food that synthetic grown plants. Nobody likes this answer. Your plants cannot tell the difference between organic and synthetic nutrients. Your soil can tell the difference, but your plants can't. The only thing your plants care about is availability of nutrients. That's it. As long as those nutrients are available for the plant to uptake, it cannot tell the difference between organic nutrients or synthetic nutrients. Now, it's when we get into soil health and things like that having an excessive salt situation can be problematic. But that doesn't mean that the plant can inherently tell the difference. It knows nutrients, and are they available? Are those nutrients available for me to uptake? If yes, then they do. It's that easy. And we get it. Organic fucking growers hate that answer. They hate it because they've based a lot of their growing on the belief that the way that they're doing it is inherently safer and that it's inherently better in some way. And while that can be true in some small circumstances, as a broad thing, it is not. It's really not. It does kind of affect how you proceed to the end game. It definitely, there are some very nuanced differences in the way that the process happens, but the plant itself cannot tell the difference. And people don't like that answer because, like I said, a lot of the people that got super pissed with me, even blocked me about this, were organic growers. Now, if you're telling me your goal in organic growing is for everything to be safe, to be as clean as possible, what does it hurt? What does flushing your plants hurt?
From what I'm hearing from you, nothing.
It hurt. It's absolutely nothing. It's not going to hurt anything in the end. So it's one of those things where I almost argue, if it doesn't hurt and we know for a fact it matters in the end, why not do it? It's not something that's costing you so much water in your water bill that it's now affecting your grow. Like, once again, I think a lot of it is a misconception. When people hear flush, they think that you're supposed to bring biblical level floods to every pot every day for 2 weeks. And that's simply not the case. It's really just about forcing your plant into a nutrient deficient state so that it's forced to use up all of what it's stored.
Yeah, also, you don't want to over flush because you're going to get fucking root rot, right? You're going to fuck up your whole root system.
See, so by that point,
is that what happened?
No. Root rot is almost always a problem earlier in growth, and it comes from not having enough roots often in your root zone and then oversaturating your root zone. Once your plants have a full pot full of roots, I mean, you could probably water them almost every day, depending on your medium. Once again, you don't want to do that in soil, but with cocoa, I mean, I could water my plants every day and it probably wouldn't hurt anything.
That's what I'm saying, because I grow in soil. So I always thought if you over flushed, and that just sat in there, just fucking.
Right. It's not great, but usually by that point, it's less of a problem than it is like earlier in growing.
Right.
But that's definitely where the distinction comes in. So not only do you not want to use massive amounts of water, but you need those dry cycles. Those dry cycles in between are just as important as they are while you're growing. So you need to have a wet cycle, dry cycle, wet cycle all the way through those last 2 weeks. So you're only actually flushing every other day, right?
Yeah, I think I started doing that like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I started that kind of a cycle because I found it a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
And like, because I read, 5 days straight, heavy gallons of water, flushed the shit out of it. I'm like, no, it looks like it just hurts my plant.
Yeah.
So I talked to Earl and listened to some other people, and I started a 2-week flush, slowly, gradually, 1 day on, 1 day off. And I found it a lot better, I think.
I've had to do single week flushes, and I do find those to be a little bit more stressful on the plant. That's why I'm not really a big fan of just force flushing everything in a 7-day cycle or even a shorter span. The goal is really to cut the plant off from being able to eat other sources and force it to use the sources it had. Now, so many people came to me and was like, well, I don't flush, but I cut the nutrients off at a certain point and just use plain water. That's flushing. You're doing the same thing. That's flushing.
I think that's 100% almost of the misconception.
Yeah,
is organic. They have great weed, and they're technically so I've run some. I don't do mostly organic soils or anything, but I've run some hot soils. I've never run into a soil where I didn't have to add something before I got to the end of the flower.
Yeah,
it could get me through veg, it could get me into flower, but as soon as I started heavy producing flower, like I couldn't get through that without adding something in an all organic soil. It took me, and maybe there's one out there, but when you get that hot, it's too hot for the young plants. So like you end up going through some different stuff. But when you add you top dress or add your food week 5 or 6, and then you only water the rest of the time, that's literally a flush. You don't have to, I think the misconception, you don't have to flush water through to flush water out for it to be a flush, because it can fucking evaporate. That's where the difference in the water and the fucking feed is. If you're watering salts, the reason you have to have a runoff,
because you got to break that salt down and it's got to exit the root zone.
Yeah, because there's going to be water that evaporates, and you're going to leave those. Yeah, those salts don't evaporate. That food doesn't evaporate. So the water goes, and yeah, some of it's uptaken, but some of it goes. And if you're in like a hard plastic pot, you don't have that as much because you're not evaporating out of the sides. If you're in a cloth pot and you have a lot of air movement down by your pot, and you might need a lot of runoff, or you might need to lower your EC, that's it. But I think almost all of it are organic people, and that's not like we're fucking organic people, because I love organic additives to weed, but them not recognizing those last few weeks of watering as flushes.
You know what it is, man, and I hate to. It's the same as the vegan cult. It's such a lifestyle that they have to preach it, because you have to believe that it's the best in order to do it. And that's the truth of it. I was an 18-year organic grower before I ever picked up a bottle nutrient, right? All super soil. Made my own super soil recipe, started with like a subcool thing, realized it was too hot, eventually had 3 different soils that I would have to use through a cycle to not end up in the problem you were just describing, where you get into mid to late flower and you're deficient, and you're like, well, it's not, with soil, it's not as easy to just add more nutrients in, especially if you're using something like powdered dry nutrients. Now, you can go the route of having rotting jars of stuff around your house, making your own liquid nutrients, all out there, and you can do it. But these aren't really efficient or easy ways to grow. It seems like it, because you just go, well, I just got to put this stuff on my plate. Yeah, you had to rot stuff in your house for months before you made that. Like, it's a whole process. And it's not, everybody gets into growing and goes, what's the easiest? So they go to the grow store, they get some soil, they get some pots, and then they realize that organic growing is not the easiest way on the planet. It is an easy way to grow plants. It's not an easy way to grow dank. If you really want to grow heady ass weed, it usually takes people years to decades to put together a soil recipe, to tailor it for specific plants, to make it so that you're not hitting mid-flower and flushing out. Like, it's tough, and it takes a long time to perfect it. It's not easy and forgiving, in the sense that if something goes wrong and I have to leave town and I have to leave a friend to run the grow, it's not always easy for them, if something goes wrong when I get back, to fix that. Whereas if I'm running in salt cocoa with, organic additives like I do, it's simple. My fix is simple. I could leave a trained chimp with a list on how to fix my grow, and I guarantee you they could figure it out. And that's the simplicity of years and years and years of work and tailoring programs and figuring out what works and what doesn't, learning plants. But I see a lot of people that jump into weed and they just grab pots and soil and they think it's going to be super easy. And then they grow weed and they go, nobody wants to smoke my weed. And it's like, growing weed is really, really easy. Growing weed that people want to smoke is much tougher. It's not as easy as people think. And it often takes a long time of trial and error and figuring out what works and what doesn't before you're going to get to that point where people are asking you for your weed,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's when you're kind of like, sweet, I'm growing good weed. I'm growing weed that people want to smoke. I love that.
Oh, yeah. So we talked about a little bit of it, but what else does an improper, other than we talk about the harsh throat, improper or no flush, what else can we expect out of like a flower like that?
So usually, to be honest with you, man, it all depends on how stocked up your plant is. So if you're running a super heavy feed and you don't flush at all, man, you're probably not going to have the same sort of flavor that you're going to have with somebody who's able to get a flush. And that's just the nuance of the flavor, the terpene profile, all of that subtlety that we love about the weed that we smoke. It all comes down to flavor. And that's what makes cannabis the most unique plant, is that not only do we care about how it burns, we care about whether it gets us high, we care about how it tastes. And that taste often comes from everything being perfect from start to finish. It's not to say you can't grow decent weed that had stress, but at the end of the day, getting that plant from its very inception to the absolute end of its life cycle and it being as healthy and as happy as possible is our goal. When we hit that end stage, making sure that there's as little nutritive left in the plant absolutely affects our flavor. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do it. That just means if the finest of weed is your priority, if flavor, taste, you put all this time in, you've done all this selection, you've gone through finding strains that matter to you, you've done all of this hard work, why ruin it at the end? Like
Yeah.
it's literally one of those things where it's so simple that you just go, what does it hurt, man? And that's where I always kind of come back to, is that at the end of the day, I think most people understand that it's important. I think there's obviously limiting factors in people's grows that kind of temper some of this. And I think a lot of that comes into it. But I mean, I think a lot of it is information saturation. So many people get on the internet, it's their first grow, they don't know what to believe. They might have read a book, they might just get on forums, they don't know what to believe. So they just pick somebody and go, this is my guy. This is my guy. I believe this guy. I see he grows good weed. This is my guy. I'm gonna stick with him. And they believe everything that person says, whole stock, right?
Hmm.
And there's just as many ways to grow weed as there are people growing it. Everybody has a different technique. There's little things that we all do different that's unique to our grow and our specific setup. But man, there's certain things that we've almost all generally agreed on at this point are important. And flavor is definitely, for me, the number one. The flavor, resin, vigor, plant. Those are the biggest things on my list. So in so much as flavor, I've chased it to that end stage. I want that finished product to lip smack. I want you to get it and you don't taste anything but flavor all over your lips. Like, the only way to do that is for it to burn well and for it to have gotten that final late stage push of using up everything it's stored.
Yeah. I noticed too, like one of my flushes that I've been less than happy with usually burns not as well, like not as well in general, but also real black on some of them. There's a common flavor that's almost like a green flavor, and the flower is definitely darker green. Um, and but most of all, that common flavor really is gross and kind of like at the forefront of any other flavor.
Yeah.
And the wax off of it is fucking brings that flavor out like 100 times.
Yeah. Well, see, the thing is, most people, and that's another one where I get into. I've had a lot of discussions with people that focus specifically on hash, because funny enough, that's another group of people that kind of goes, maybe it's not that important. I'm not smoking the flower. It definitely matters for trichome, final trichome development, in that you really want those trichomes to swell as much as possible and to produce as much oil within that waxy cuticle as humanly possible, right? In concentrating that, especially if we're using solvents specifically, all of what's in there is now concentrated. So if there's extra nutrients, you're concentrating that. If there's pesticides, you're concentrating that. Whatever is present in that material is going to then be present in your hash. So that's when you start to see BHO, which shouldn't, if made properly, ever leave char of any kind. It should just be pure oil. And then you see BHO that chars bad black. That's because they didn't flush. That's because they used sprayed shit on their weed. It's because they cut corners, right? Yeah. It's generally because you cut corners.
So we talked about a couple of the arguments, like nature doesn't flush. We talked about that a little bit. Organic doesn't need to flush. Like we talked about some of that argument. What about, so a lot of it is, I've heard people say at least, if you need to flush, you're running too much food. That's one that is a little hard for me to wrap my head around why somebody might think that, other than like an organic, if you're running straight organic, then maybe that's the case.
So organic plants uptake just like synthetic plants do. Yeah. The reason we know this is an organic plant can be locked out, which means that it can uptake more than it needs and become into a state of stress because of it, whether it's nutrients toxicity, whatever the case may be. That means that those nutrients are in that plant just like they are in any other cannabis plant. The nature of hemp and cannabis is that it's a hyperaccumulator. It accumulates more nutrients than it needs, and it holds it within its plant material. So if your plant is feeding at its most optimum level, you are absolutely going to need to flush. It doesn't matter if you're in soil or if you're in a soilless mix. If your plant is using the optimum amount of nutrients through its entire life, it should still need to be flushed. Now, I guess the big nuance for me would be that in synthetic specifically and in soilless mix, you're obviously going to have more present in your root zone, right, towards the end. That's just the nature of the beast. You're almost always going to have more in your root zone. So the process of getting your root zone neutralized to a non-nutritious point is definitely going to be different. That point is definitely going to be different for soil and for non-soil mixes. But the process is still the same of ridding the root zone of everything that's nutritious and then forcing the plant to use what it's stored. Yeah. This is, I always hate this. This is basic plant biology. This is shit they teach in high school 101 biology classes of how plants store nutrients, how plants photosynthesize, how plants use those nutrients to create energy. And especially with certain plants hold and store more than they need. It's the nature of the plant, whether there's, no matter how it's grown, it's just the nature of the plant. So when we get into bigger arguments about, why, who, where, if you understand just the basics of how cannabis works, we know that it's got more than it needs. So as we get to the end, we don't want that to be there. It's just the nature of trying to kind of hit that end point where you've got plants that have shown color. And usually I say show color because most plants will eventually start to either yellow or purple or red or beautiful fall time colors. And they'll give you a look. Like they'll kind of give you that like, all right, I've kind of stopped producing. And you kind of see swell, and now it's not swelling anymore. That's the point where you start looking at the exit, It's the point where you kind of start looking at like, okay, it's time to wrap up. What do I need to do? What do I need to do? Whether that's flushing your root zone or just using plain water through your last 2 weeks and not adding anything else nutritious, it's not that tough. Like it's, it's just one of those things that I think I'm still praying it was a rumor started on Reddit. There's still a part of me that just thinks it's the greatest troll yet, and that there's some kid sitting behind his computer that's just like, we got them to not flush their weed. But I don't know. It just kind of goes against generally decades of basic growing practices. And I haven't really, I'm still kind of at a loss for like if you, I'm purely science guy. If you come to me with empirical, listen, man, I've been doing this for 20 years and I swear to you, it's the best. And there's a reason. And this is why. I'll listen to anything anybody has to say. But at the end of the day, I go, I've also been doing this for 20 years. I've run and thrown a lot of plants into pipes, a lot of plants. And at the end of the day, I could always pick the one that didn't get that full finish. Whether it's my weed, whether it's other people's weed, I can almost always point it out and go, there's something about that one. It leaves a nug in the bottom of your pipe. Like there's just a black crust that just doesn't break and burn. We've all seen it's like a charcoal. You end up smoking a bowl and you've got a charcoal in the bottom of your pipe. You didn't flush.
Right.
You didn't flush.
Shit. So Earl came up with this line. I thought it was pretty funny. So do anti-flushers equal flat earthers at this point? Earl, I thought that was brilliant.
Once again, man, I get stuck in. I like to think that people are genuine, and the people. Listen, if you haven't seen the post, I'm sure it's still on my Instagram. I try to leave those posts up for posterity because there tends to be the comment section tends to be
comments are best.
It's informative. There's generally a lot of humor. There's generally a lot of like, you're going to laugh, but I always want them to be there because I tend to go back to a lot of these posts. You'll see some of the ones I posted this week are rehashes. They're 2 and 3 years old from memes I made way back. Cliches are cliche for a reason. And they go in these cycles and you start to see like there'll be a little bit of it for a little while and then it falls off and then you don't hear about it for a while. And then all of a sudden it's like there's a church of no flush now. And now it's a thing and people are swearing by it. And it's just funny how these things go. But when you go back and you look at all of these comments, there were people that were very adamant that I was wrong, dead wrong, that flushing was important. That one poor girl blocked me. And I'm going to be fair, I did kind of go in on her a little bit because she started saying some silly shit. And I'm real bad about like, it's all good until I see you say something that I don't think came from experience. When I see you say something that I'm almost positive you're repeating that you heard from somebody else, that just makes this thing in the back of my head hurt. And it's really tough because I go, man, listen, I have experience in this. I'm telling you, we've done this experiment. I've seen it happen. My own 2 eyes. I'm not repeating something I read. This isn't from the internet. This is from decades of just loving plants and putting hands on plants. And my priority being at all time the utmost quality. And once you get to that point, I will almost throw plants. I'll throw plants in edibles if I don't get a fucking flush on them. I'll throw plants in something else because I feel bad about presenting that to people as flower and it not being perfect. And so that's another thing that I see a lot in the weed business is, especially in the commercial industry, I grew it, so somebody has to buy it. And it's like, I get it. I mean, I get that mentality. I understand that we all got bills to pay. But at the end of the day, once you hit a point where all you can accept is quality, it's hard for me to look at plants that don't burn right. And I'm going to give that to a friend as a representation of my work. That means something to me. That means something to me. You can say a lot about me. Just don't say my weed's not dank. I mean, that's the passion. And that's every single grow. It's like, what can be done differently? What can I do a little bit better? What can I push a little bit harder so that I can get that optimization, but at the end of the day, have the best flower in the room? And if that's your goal, you're going to try out a little bit of everything. You know, you're going to try out little things, and you're going to go through a phase where maybe you think flushing's not important. But if you do it long enough, you're going to realize it very much is. It's very important. But I think a lot of the debate, I don't think it's phony. I think a lot of the flat earth shit is people just wanting to have an opinion that's outside the norm, right? It's more philosophical than it is per se rooted in logic and basis in scientific fact. But with this, I think a lot of it is misconception. And I think we addressed a lot of it today of just verbiage, semantics, understanding what we're really doing and what the larger point is, that it's not really just how much water can I push through my root zone for 2 whole weeks so that it looks like the parting of the Red Sea every single day and I'm just wet vacuuming up water everywhere. That's not what we mean. That's not what we mean. That's not what we're trying to get at. It's more of just getting your plants to a point where by the end of their cycle, they've used up what's left in your root zone and they're forced to essentially use what they've stored. That's it. That's it. And so many people...
It's pretty simple there, Terp.
So many people in the comments were so upset. And then they would go, well, I only used plain water for the last 2 weeks anyway. And I just...
That's called what we were just talking about for the last hour.
But see, now you see why it's easy for me to just make a meme and make a joke about it, because I've seen it so many times that it's exhausting for me sometimes.
Humility is a lot better than arguing. That's for sure.
Maybe this goes against what we're talking about this whole time. And I do have a couple things that I do, and maybe you have some criticism on. But so flushing on a time crunch.
Yeah, this is just like, I was really interested after everything we just talked about. I read that. I was like, you know what, Bo? But there's some people that have had to do it on a crunch, because you said earlier you've had to do it on a crunch. So this is interesting. When I read this question earlier, I was like, oh, okay. A little controversy at the end. A little throw the wrench at Terp here at the end. I like it.
There's some, well, there's a lot of reasons, from like forgetting to a landlord coming in next month, and now all of a sudden you're planning to run 70 days or something, and you have to run it to 63. So what I like to do with salts is fulvic acids. I think that helps a ton. I saw my fastest EC drop out of my water runoff with fulvic acids. And organics, I don't really read the EC much for, but microbial teas is what I've always read. And it makes sense. It gets in, it breaks down. The more it breaks down, the easier it flushes out. Any other ways? I know a lot of people just say extra water, flush it out. We've already talked about how not that.
So,
but any other ways, any other things you like to do?
Yeah, keeping a close eye on your feed, making sure you're not in the 2,000 and 3,000s as you're getting close to that point, knowing conscientiously where you're at through the entire process. So what I'll do is, if I haven't by some weird chance and I'm just floating on happiness and I'm hitting week 7 and everything just looks great and I haven't really had to check it, everything's pumping out heavy, and then I look and I'm at 3K. Yeah, I mean, I poop a little bit and then I flush and then I bring it down to a reasonable number, because you always have to remember there's only so much in that root zone your plants can absorb. So if you're ridiculously high at that point, getting that out is still not going to hurt anything. But kind of monitoring that. Anybody that knows cocoa knows how you fluctuate your fucking nutrients back to even. You just take your feed and flush until your feed comes out. Your runoff comes out the same as your feed. So making sure that as you're getting close to that end point, that's not a problem, is going to ensure that they're going to be able to uptake what they've stored a little bit earlier, and you're not having to spend excessive amounts of time just power flushing to clean your medium out. Once again, that can be a lot tougher in soil, because nutrients in soil generally have to break down. It's not where you can just pour a bunch of water and it's all going to be gone. That's usually not the case if you've got mixed in nutrients and stuff. It takes a longer time for that to break down and to give. Whereas in cocoa, we're just dealing with a sponge. You can essentially just squeeze the sponge and make it go back to what you want, just like that. But really, knowing your feed, knowing where you're at going into those last couple weeks, and making sure you're not in an excessive feed state in your root zone so that you won't need to really power flush. Let's be honest, 2 weeks is a little it's a little, usually, but as I'm getting close to the end of 2 weeks, I'll maybe go 10 days because once that's fully flushed your root zone, it's going to use up its reserves within a couple of days, within a wet dry cycle or two, to be honest with you. It doesn't store that much, but getting to that point can be really tough if you still got a heavy root zone. So just keeping that root zone to a even point as you're approaching final stages, you can get it done in 7 to 10 days, no problem. Like I will tell you, sometimes I felt, especially in soilless mix, 14 days is a lot of time. They might start dying on you on day 12. Just being conscientious and being ready to pull at that point, you can get it done quicker. But you really, in order to get it done quicker, you really need to make sure you don't have an excessive amount of food in your root zone.
Yeah. I measure my EC, and when it is 0.2 or under, 0.1 or 0.2 over what I feed, I give it 24 hours. As I know I got 1 day, maybe 36.
I think I just thought of something when you said that. I think one of the other big problems with organic growers in this discussion is that there's nothing to measure. So most of organic growing is guessing. It's guessing and praying
trial,
you're hoping you got enough in your root zone and you hope you get enough each time you feed. There's nothing to measure. There's almost no way to measure other than a soil test, taking a soil sample and sending it for a soil test. There's no way that just in your grow, you can just test real quickly and say, there's this much phosphorus, this much potassium, this much nitrogen in my root zone.
You would know because you grew for how many years in organic
18 years soil? All soil. 18 years all soil.
So you would know, right? So
yeah. There are now there are definitely ways where you can send a sample off and have that sample tested. Yeah. But in making decisions in your grow, there's no meter. There's no meter you can get. There's nothing you can, and that's, I'm going to be honest with you. That's why I stepped away from organic growing. Even after a decade or more, 18 years of growing organically, it didn't feel like I was getting proper feeds every time I fed. So I didn't feel like I was optimizing my grow, and it didn't feel gram for gram. I was yielding as much as I could, nor did I feel like I was pushing the quality level to where I've been able to get in the system I run now.
Cool. Is pH important during the flush?
Yeah, definitely. But it's just as important as it is the entire time. I wouldn't really recommend like super high or super low pH specifically. You still want to stay in like a 5.8 in cocoa, a 6.1 in soil, and you generally want to still make sure that that's kind of what you're feeding. And that's another one of those funny things. When you start talking about stuff like that with most organic growers, they don't know anything about pH. They don't know anything about ppms. They don't even know what those meters do because they're almost irrelevant to them. Like if you kind of generally know that your water is in a reasonable state and you're not in one of those places where you have super alkaline or super shitty water, you'll never need a pH meter. You could probably grow for years and never need a pH meter. That doesn't mean you're always in the right range, but it's one of those things that like you should know. Like 6.1 in soil is kind of where you want to be. Within a point or two, 6.1, 6.2 in soil. And that's going to make sure, once again, making sure that the pH of your soil is always in that range, that perfect range, is going to mean those nutrients are going to be the most available to the plant. It's going to be as optimized as it can to the plant so the plant can use it as much as it needs and doesn't have excessive amounts that it can't use.
Sweet. Terp, man, tell us what's coming down the pipe from you and tell us everybody where we can find you.
6 weeks in Jamaica. No, I'm joking. Before we started,
let us know because Earl and I will come and tag along and have some fun.
I always hit that point, and I'm like, man, I'm just gonna drop it all and go to Jamaica for 6 weeks. Nag Champa, we're doing some Nag Champa work next. I've run drastically low on my stock of Nag Champa crosses, and the good people in South Africa at Leapfrog Genetics are blowing that strain up to heights that I had never hoped for it, and just it's becoming a huge big thing globally, and it's been huge to see that strain just go around parts of the world. And then people hit me up and go, hey man, I heard about your Nag Champa, and I'm like, from who? And they're like, Jacques in South Africa. And I'm like, that's the coolest thing to me ever, is just other people in other parts of the world falling in love with my weed. They're running greenhouses of it. They're really pumping it out. And he's got a cut that just makes everybody's mouth just water and drool, and beautiful black plant with just tons of white everywhere. It's just an amazing one. And so I'm going to do some kind of reflavoring on it. I've hit a point where I don't think I'm going to do deep, long filial lines. So I'm going to go back and do a F2 open pollination. So we're going to bust out some of the original F1s and do a new F2 line, but with as much variety as we possibly can put in the line. So maybe, a handful of males and a handful of females. So doing all the selections for those now, and then hopefully by the end of the year, early next year, we'll see how it goes.
Sweet. Love it. Terp, we appreciate you coming on again, man. What is it, 7 times, 6 times? Fucking
Jesus. Man, we're starting to rival Growcast, man. I've done his pod a ton, and man, I thank you guys so much. Like I said before, I've kind of gotten away from doing my own. I'm gonna get back to doing them, but I always love these, and just getting to chat with you guys and with other passionate weed people. It's my passion. It's what I love.
We love having you on, man. But there was one thing Big Earl and I forgot to talk about when it comes to this.
No, I forgot.
Oh,
second most important part of flushing. Extra CalMag.
That's very true.
Big Earl?
That's exactly right.
Big Earl said it. Everybody out there in the world, we love you. Don't forget the CalMag. Peace! Check out our cannabis lifestyle brand online at 8decades.com. Our custom smokes and accessories are perfect for your coffee table, bedroom nightstand, or kitchen counter. They're designed for you to show them off. The Canna community is also loving our hemp and cotton blend t-shirts, sweatshirts, scarves, and hats, finished off with our 8 Decades logo. We've got some awesome long-lasting goods that will be your favorite for years to come. 8 Decades, because a 9th decade of cannabis prohibition isn't acceptable.